The room looks harmless. Beige carpet, folding chairs in neat rows, a banner promising clarity, success, and personal growth. People clap on cue. Smiles linger a little too long. At the front stands a man introduced as a genius, a humanitarian, a mentor. Keith Raniere speaks softly, confidently, telling the audience they are special for being here. He says they are choosing a higher path. NXIVM sells itself as a self-help organization, executive success programs, intensive workshops, rational inquiry. Participants are told they are learning to overcome fear, break bad habits, and unlock human potential. According to former members, the language is precise by design. Words like empowerment and ethics are repeated until they feel scientific. The fees are high, but framed as investments in the self. Recruitment often begins through friends. A recommendation, a success story, someone who seems calmer, richer, more focused after taking the courses. Newcomers are praised for commitment. Skepticism is reframed as weakness. Questions become resistance. Progress is measured not just by attendance, but by obedience. Inside the organization, a hierarchy quietly forms. Titles multiply. Sashes are worn. Rank matters. Advancement depends on pleasing those above you. Raniere sits at the center, referred to by followers as Vanguard. According to later testimony, he is presented as the smartest man in the room, someone whose insights should not be challenged. Disagreement is reframed as personal failure. Then comes the inner circle. Select members are told they are being trusted with something deeper, more exclusive. Participation requires proof of commitment. This proof takes the form of collateral, personal secrets, explicit images, letters that could damage reputations or relationships. Members are told the collateral is symbolic, a way to overcome fear and prove integrity. They are assured it will never be used. But former insiders later tell investigators that the collateral becomes leverage. Instructions grow more invasive. Sleep deprivation, strict diets, orders delivered as personal growth assignments. Refusal is met with reminders of what has already been surrendered. What once felt voluntary begins to feel compulsory. The system is layered so that control rarely feels sudden. Each step is framed as a choice. Each escalation justified as discipline. According to prosecutors, this gradual narrowing of options is the point. By the time members realize they are trapped, leaving feels impossible without personal destruction. Outside the seminar rooms, patterns begin to surface. Family members notice changes, financial strain, isolation from old friends, absolute devotion to the group's teachings. Complaints reach authorities. Journalists begin asking questions. Investigators start mapping relationships, money flows, and repeated allegations that sound disturbingly similar. The public image remains polished. Success stories are promoted. Critics are dismissed as bitter or unethical. Raniere continues to speak about morality and self-mastery. But behind closed doors, according to later court filings, a system of coercion tightens its grip. The cliffhanger comes from those who lived inside it. They describe a structure that looks consensual on the surface, professional and voluntary, until the moment you try to say no. The courtroom is quiet when the charges are read. Gone are the banners and applause. No pledges, no affirmations. Prosecutors do not describe NXIVM as a self-help company gone wrong. They describe it as a criminal enterprise, a racketeering operation built on manipulation, secrecy, and control. Federal investigators argue that what happened inside NXIVM was not confusion or miscommunication. It was a pattern. According to the government, the hierarchy was intentional, the collateral systematic, and the coercion deliberate. They lay out emails, text messages, financial records, and testimony showing how loyalty flowed upward while power flowed inward toward Keith Raniere. Former members take the stand. Some speak haltingly, others with precision. They describe being told they were free to leave at any time, while being reminded of the damaging material already in the organization's possession. Prosecutors emphasize this contradiction again and again. Consent obtained under threat, they argue, is not consent at all. The defense pushes back. Raniere's attorneys frame NXIVM as an unconventional lifestyle group. They argue that participants were adults, capable of choice. They describe the relationships as consensual, the practices as misunderstood, the allegations as exaggerated by regret and hindsight. They warn the jury against criminalizing alternative belief systems. But prosecutors keep returning to structure. This is not about beliefs, they say. It is about actions. They point to evidence that Raniere directed others, issued orders, and benefited personally from obedience. They argue that the so-called inner circle existed to serve him, while insulating him from direct accountability. As the trial unfolds, the scope widens. Financial exploitation, identity theft, immigration fraud, psychological control. The government argues that these were not isolated acts, but interconnected tools used to maintain dominance. Each piece, they say, reinforces the others. Victim impact statements shift the room. Former followers speak about lost years, broken families, careers abandoned, shame that lingered long after leaving. Some describe how difficult it was to accept they had been manipulated while believing they were choosing growth. Others describe the moment they realized the cost of obedience had been far higher than promised. When the verdict comes, it is decisive. Guilty on multiple counts, including racketeering. The judge describes Raniere as a man who used ideology as camouflage and empowerment as bait. At sentencing, the court emphasizes the harm was not abstract. It was personal, repeated, and lasting. Raniere receives a lengthy federal sentence measured not in symbolism, but in decades. Restitution is ordered. Associated entities collapse under scrutiny. Former leaders distance themselves. Trainings shut down. What once presented itself as an elite path to success becomes a warning label in headlines and court records. The emotional kicker is simple and unsettling. A movement sold as self-improvement did not just fail its followers. It weaponized their trust. What began with applause in a seminar room ended with silence in a courtroom, and a lasting reminder that control often arrives wearing the language of growth. The morning begins like any other in Tokyo. Trains glide into stations, office workers check watches, students grip briefcases and paper cups of coffee. The city hums with routine, unaware that inside a secluded religious organization, plans have already crossed a point of no return. Shoko Asahara presents himself as a spiritual guide, at first a partially blind yoga instructor who blends elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, and apocalyptic Christianity. His message attracts followers searching for meaning in a rapidly modernizing Japan. He speaks of enlightenment, purification, and escape from a corrupt world. For many early recruits, the appeal is not fear, but purpose. As membership grows, Asahara's claims escalate. He begins describing himself not just as a teacher, but as a messianic figure. His prophecies turn darker. He predicts an inevitable global collapse and insists that only those within Aum Shinrikyo will survive what he calls the final conflict. Doubt is reframed as weakness. Obedience becomes proof of faith. The group isolates itself physically and psychologically. Communal living replaces outside relationships. Sleep deprivation, strict routines, and internal punishments are introduced under the language of discipline and spiritual training. Followers are encouraged to sever ties with family members who question the movement. Information from outside sources is labeled dangerous. Aum's recruitment strategy evolves. Highly educated individuals, scientists, engineers, medical professionals are actively sought out. Their skills are praised as tools for salvation. Donations increase. Businesses tied to the group generate revenue. What looks like religious devotion on the surface begins to resemble a tightly controlled organization with resources, hierarchy, and secrecy. Asahara's teachings shift again. He tells followers that the coming disaster is no longer abstract. It is imminent. He speaks of enemies everywhere: governments, journalists, defectors, all framed as forces trying to destroy the group before it can fulfill its destiny. The language of defense slowly morphs into the language of preemption. Inside Aum's inner circle, belief gives way to logistics. Secure compounds are established, equipment is acquired. Experiments are conducted under the justification of preparation. Members are told these actions are necessary to protect the faithful and accelerate a prophesied cleansing of society. Moral boundaries blur as instructions are framed as sacred duty. The organization's structure tightens. Orders come from the top. Questioning them is equated with betrayal. Those who resist face punishment or confinement. always described as corrective rather than cruel. Loyalty is rewarded. Silence is enforced. The group becomes closed, inward-facing, and increasingly militant in mindset. Outside, Japanese authorities begin noticing unusual patterns: disappearances, complaints from families, unexplained activities linked to Aum properties. Media scrutiny increases. Asahara responds by amplifying his warnings. He tells followers that persecution confirms his prophecies, that the outside world must be confronted before it destroys them. The cliffhanger arrives quietly. A belief system that once promised transcendence now frames violence as prevention. Preparation turns operational. Faith is no longer just something to hold, it becomes something to deploy. And as Tokyo continues its ordinary routines, a plan forms that will turn prophecy into a weapon, and belief into a national trauma. The ordinary morning shatters without warning. Commuter trains roll through Tokyo's underground arteries, packed with office workers and students beginning their day. Then confusion spreads. Passengers stagger. Eyes burn. Breathing becomes difficult. Station platforms turn into scenes of panic as people flee cars and collapse on benches. Emergency calls flood in from multiple lines at once. Authorities respond fast, but the picture is unclear. At first, officials speak cautiously, describing a hazardous substance and urging calm. Medical teams rush to stations, treating victims for exposure, while police secure platforms and tunnels. Hospitals activate emergency protocols. The scale becomes undeniable, as reports confirm coordinated releases across several subway lines. Japan is stunned. News broadcasts interrupt programming. Streets empty near transit hubs. Schools delay openings. The word sarin enters public language not as history, but as lived reality. According to investigators, the attack is deliberate, synchronized, and designed to spread fear far beyond the underground. Attention turns quickly to Aum Shinrikyo. The group had already drawn scrutiny for secretive practices and confrontations with critics. Now, evidence begins to surface. Chemicals traced, vehicles identified, witness statements compiled. Police raids follow, targeting compounds linked to the organization. Inside, they find equipment, records, and materials that point to preparation rather than accident. As the net widens, arrests mount. Senior members are taken into custody. Laboratories are shut down. Assets are seized. Shoko Asahara disappears from public view, prompting a nationwide manhunt. When he is finally found, hidden within a compound, the image reinforces the scale of deception investigators say defined his leadership. The legal process unfolds over years. Prosecutors present the case as an organized campaign directed from the top. They argue that Asahara's teachings did not merely inspire followers, but instructed them. Defense teams raise questions about responsibility and mental state. Courts examine volumes of evidence, testimony from former members, and the organizational structure that enabled the attack. Verdicts come slowly, methodically. Multiple leaders receive severe sentences. Asahara is convicted and ultimately executed under Japanese law, bringing formal closure to the central figure, though not to the harm itself. Survivors continue medical treatment. Families mourn losses measured not only in lives, but in trust and safety. The aftermath reshapes Japan's approach to religious oversight and emergency response. Laws are reviewed. Monitoring increases. Public debate wrestles with how a modern society, built on order and routine, could be exploited so completely. The scars remain visible in anniversaries, memorials, and the quiet caution that lingers in crowded spaces. The emotional kicker endures because it is so simple. Millions boarded trains that morning expecting nothing more than another day. Instead, belief was turned into a delivery system for fear. An ordinary commute became a permanent national wound, a reminder that when authority demands obedience without question, even faith can be weaponized. The town of Antelope, Oregon, sits quietly in the high desert, a place defined by long roads, open land, and predictable routines. Then, almost overnight, everything changes. New faces appear, properties are purchased, meetings multiply. What begins as curiosity soon turns into unease, as residents realize a well-organized movement has arrived with money, discipline, and a vision that does not require local consent. At the center is Bhagwan Sri Rajneeshees, a spiritual leader whose teachings blend meditation, personal liberation, and rejection of traditional authority. His followers describe him as enlightened. Critics describe him as manipulative. What is undeniable is scale. Thousands of devotees relocate to Oregon, transforming a remote ranch into a self-contained city they call Rajneeshpuram. The branding is utopian. Red clothing, slogans about love, awareness, and freedom from societal constraints. The community presents itself as peaceful, productive, and misunderstood. Internally, however, structure hardens. Hierarchies form. Loyalty is tested. Dissent is quietly removed. Decision-making concentrates among a small inner circle that frames opposition as persecution. As Rajneeshees expand their footprint, friction with surrounding towns intensifies. Zoning disputes, voting concerns, legal challenges. Locals worry about being outnumbered at the ballot box by a movement that openly discusses political takeover as a survival strategy. County meetings become tense. Accusations fly on both sides. Trust evaporates. Inside Rajneeshpuram, rhetoric shifts. According to later court records and testimony, leaders begin speaking less about coexistence and more about control. Opponents are no longer neighbors with different views. They are obstacles. The language turns strategic. How to neutralize resistance. How to secure elections. How to ensure dominance without appearing violent. The us versus them logic becomes central. Members are told that outside forces want to destroy their way of life. Every legal setback is reframed as proof of conspiracy. In this atmosphere, extreme ideas gain traction. Ethical lines blur when actions are justified as defensive. Winning, not persuasion, becomes the goal. At the same time, the movement experiments with influence tactics, bringing in unhoused individuals from other states to shift voter rolls, running candidates for local office, testing how far the law can be bent before it breaks. Each maneuver pushes boundaries further, reinforcing the belief that conventional rules do not apply to an enlightened community fighting for survival. Behind closed doors, according to later findings, conversations grow darker. Leaders discuss methods to suppress voter turnout in nearby towns, not by debate, not by campaigning, but by incapacitation. The idea is framed as temporary, non-lethal, necessary, a way to win without open confrontation. The cliffhanger arrives here, the moment when belief gives way entirely to calculation. A plan takes shape that abandons spiritual ideals in favor of biological harm. The movement that once promised awakening now prepares an act designed to make ordinary people too sick to participate in democracy. The ethics are already gone. The only remaining question is execution. The first signs appear quietly. In the Dalles, a small city along the Columbia River, residents begin reporting sudden stomach illness. Clinics fill with patients describing similar symptoms. Emergency rooms note a spike that does not match seasonal patterns. Public health officials initially suspect food handling errors or a routine outbreak, the kind that usually resolves without headlines. But the numbers keep rising. More than 700 people fall ill. Restaurants are inspected. Ingredients are tested. Workers are questioned. Nothing obvious explains the scale. What troubles investigators most is distribution. The cases are spread across multiple locations, tied not to one kitchen, but to everyday community spaces. As alarms escalate, epidemiologists identify salmonella as the cause. Still, the source remains unclear. There is no contaminated shipment, no single supplier, no accidental failure large enough to explain what is happening. Behind the scenes, officials begin to consider a possibility almost unthinkable at the time: deliberate contamination. Attention slowly turns outward, toward the broader tensions already simmering in the county. The Rajneeshee movement has been openly clashing with local authorities. Legal battles over land use and elections are ongoing. Rumors circulate of aggressive political tactics, nothing concrete, but enough to raise questions that investigators cannot ignore. The breakthrough does not come immediately. It unfolds over months, then years, through overlapping inquiries into immigration fraud, financial violations, and internal power struggles within Rajneeshpuram itself. Former members begin cooperating with authorities. Statements emerge describing experiments, rehearsals, and discussions that align disturbingly well with what happened in the Dalles. Investigators piece together a chilling picture. Salad bars intentionally contaminated to sicken voters and suppress turnout in a local election. The goal, prosecutors later argue, was not chaos for its own sake, but control, prevent participation, tilt democracy, win quietly. Federal and state cases follow. Key figures within the movement are charged. Evidence includes lab materials, internal communications, and testimony from insiders who describe how far leadership was willing to go once ethical limits were discarded. The Salmonella attack is formally recognized as a criminal act, the largest bioterror incident in United States history at that time. As legal pressure mounts, the Rajneeshee experiment collapses. Leaders flee or are arrested. Properties are seized. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh himself leaves the country amid immigration violations and mounting scrutiny. Rajneeshpuram is abandoned, its grand vision reduced to empty buildings and legal records. Courts issue sentences. Plea deals are entered. The movement dissolves under the weight of its own actions. What once claimed spiritual liberation ends in indictments, deportations, and lasting stigma. The emotional weight lingers far beyond Oregon. Public health agencies rewrite protocols. Law enforcement rethinks how ideology can turn into weaponization. Communities reassess how easily trust can be exploited when belief is framed as moral superiority. The final image is not of a cult compound or a courtroom, but of ordinary people, families who ate lunch, went to work, and unknowingly became tools in a power struggle they never agreed to join. When faith is used to justify control, it is the public that absorbs the harm. The courtroom becomes the place where chaos is forced into language. By the time Charles Manson and several members of the so-called family are brought to trial, the crimes have already saturated the public imagination. The names Tate and LaBianca no longer belong only to families, they are symbols. Prosecutors know they are not just trying a series of killings. They are trying an idea that a man who rarely touched a weapon can still be legally responsible for what others carried out. From the beginning, the prosecution's strategy is clear. This is not about spontaneous violence or rogue followers. This is about command responsibility, about indoctrination, about a system where obedience replaced judgment, and where Manson's words functioned as instructions even when phrased as philosophy. Witnesses describe how Manson controlled daily life, food, sleep, movement, relationships. Former followers testify that he framed himself as a prophet, a teacher, even a messiah. He spoke in riddles, but the message was consistent. Loyalty was survival, and outsiders were enemies. The courtroom watches Manson closely. He interrupts proceedings. He stares down jurors. He carves an X into his forehead, later transforming it into a swastika, insisting it represents being crossed out by the system. His behavior is erratic, theatrical, defiant, and prosecutors argue it is performative, designed to reinforce the very control he exercised outside the courtroom. The defense attempts to fracture the narrative. They argue that Manson did not physically commit the murders, that his followers were adults with agency, that the prosecution is criminalizing speech and belief rather than direct action. But the state counters with structure, timelines, testimony, patterns. They show how ideas were planted, reinforced, and operationalized. How Manson spoke of violence as destiny, and how his followers interpreted that destiny as instruction. The fog begins to lift. Jurors hear how he sent others out to do something witchy, how he praised violence afterward, how he positioned himself as untouchable while others acted in his name. Slowly, the case reframes leadership itself as the weapon. The verdicts are delivered. Guilty. Manson is sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment after California suspends capital punishment. Several of his followers receive similar sentences, but the legal outcome does not end the story. For decades, Charles Manson remains a cultural fixation. Interviews, books, films. His image is recycled until it risks overshadowing the victims. Prosecutors, survivors, and families repeatedly stress the same point. The danger was not his eccentricity, it was his influence. Manson dies in prison many years later. The family dissolves, but the questions linger. How does control hide behind charisma? How does manipulation masquerade as meaning? And how many people follow destructive leaders not because they are forced, but because they are convinced? The emotional truth left behind is unsettling in its simplicity. Control does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers until others are willing to kill for it. The compound sits far from paved roads, surrounded by forest and silence. The kind of place where time feels slowed and the outside world begins to fade. For newcomers, it is introduced as a refuge, a place to reset, to live simply, to escape what Roch Thériault describes as a corrupt society rushing toward collapse. For those who stay, it becomes something else entirely. Thériault presents himself as a prophet. He speaks in absolutes, framing every instruction as divine necessity rather than personal desire. Food, sleep, work, relationships, all are regulated. Members are encouraged to sever ties with family and friends, not through force at first, but through ideology. Outsiders, they are told, cannot understand. Doubt is framed as weakness. Loyalty becomes proof of faith. Dependency grows slowly. The group pools resources. Thériault controls access to necessities. Members begin to rely on him not only for guidance, but for survival. He decides who eats, who rests, who is punished. Over time, the distinction between spiritual leadership and total authority disappears. Rules multiply. Small corrections are introduced as discipline. A task done incorrectly results in humiliation. Questioning a directive leads to isolation. Thériault frames punishment as purification pain, as a pathway to obedience. What begins as symbolic enforcement escalates. Boundaries erode, replaced by fear and confusion. Inside the group, autonomy dissolves. Members are encouraged to confess private thoughts, which Thériault later uses as leverage. He positions himself as the sole interpreter of truth, warning that leaving the group means spiritual ruin or physical danger. The world beyond the compound is described as hostile, poisoned, unlivable. Those who consider leaving are met with intimidation. Stories circulate of defectors who suffer misfortune. Thériault reinforces the idea that survival depends on staying close to him. The isolation is no longer geographic, it is psychological. As years pass, the internal logic of the group hardens. Acts that would once have been unthinkable are reframed as necessary. Suffering is normalized. Members are conditioned to see cruelty not as abuse, but as correction. The language of care is used to justify control. Fear replaces choice. By this stage, leaving is no longer a simple decision. Members have no money, no external support, and no clear sense of identity outside the group. Thériault ensures this dependency remains absolute. He speaks of enemies everywhere. Authorities, doctors, former friends, all supposedly plotting against them. Inside the compound, his word is law. Dissent is treated as betrayal. Silence becomes self-protection. The cold open promise of refuge collapses into something darker, a closed system where obedience is enforced, autonomy is stripped away, and harm is reframed as devotion. And as the rules continue to escalate, one truth becomes increasingly clear: this is no longer a community built on belief. It is a structure built on control. The cliffhanger hangs heavy over the compound. When fear becomes the foundation, escape is no longer a matter of will, it becomes a matter of survival. The silence does not break all at once, it fractures. A member reaches out, another hesitates, then confirms details. Eventually, the outside world, long dismissed as hostile and corrupt, begins to hear consistent accounts that cannot be ignored. Authorities first encounter confusion rather than clarity. The allegations are extreme. The location is remote. Many former members are fearful, conditioned to distrust officials and to protect the man they were taught was their only source of truth. But the accounts share the same structure: control disguised as faith, obedience enforced through punishment, and a leader whose authority had no limit. Investigators begin assembling timelines. Medical professionals review injuries that do not align with accidents or illness. Witnesses describe escalating discipline, enforced isolation, and a climate where questioning directives carried consequences. What emerges is not a single incident, but a pattern repeated acts tied to domination rather than belief. When law enforcement intervenes, the group collapses quickly. Without the isolation and constant reinforcement, the spell breaks. Survivors describe the shock of re-entering ordinary life, everyday sounds, open conversations, choices without permission. Many struggled to articulate what happened, not because it was unclear, but because it had become normal to them over time. Criminal proceedings focus on structure. Prosecutors outline how Thériault established dependency, restricted autonomy, and reframed harm as necessity. Expert testimony explains how coercive control operates in closed groups, why members comply, and why leaving can feel impossible even without physical barriers. The defense attempts to recast the events as misunderstood, spiritual practices, or consensual communal living. The court rejects this framing. Evidence demonstrates that consent was systematically stripped away through fear, isolation, and manipulation. Thériault is convicted. The sentence reflects not a single act, but a sustained system of domination. In custody, his control ends, but the consequences do not. Survivors face years of recovery. Some carry permanent injuries. Others confront fractured identities, lost family ties, and the challenge of rebuilding trust. The case leaves a mark beyond the courtroom. It becomes a reference point in discussions about cult dynamics, coercive leadership, and the warning signs of spiritual abuse. Social services and law enforcement agencies revisit how they assess isolated communities and credibility of survivor testimony. For the public, the story is unsettling not because of spectacle, but because of gradualism. How control intensified slowly, how ordinary people were drawn in, and how belief was used to justify harm. The emotional weight settles on what cannot be restored. Time, safety, and the sense of self that was eroded piece by piece. The damage is not confined to a compound in the forest. It extends into lives permanently altered by a system designed to remove choice. The final measure of this story is not the length of a sentence or the closure of a trial. It is the cost paid by those who lived under control, a reminder that when authority goes unchecked, the damage can last long after the leader is gone. The setting is calm. A chalet at the edge of a forest. Candles arranged with care. Soft voices speaking of harmony and transition. To an outsider, it looks like a retreat. To those inside, it is presented as preparation. The order of the solar temple sells transcendence. Its leaders speak of purity, destiny, and a passage beyond a broken world. Members are told they are chosen, not superior, but awakened. The language is soothing. The structure is not. Decisions flow downward. Questions are reframed as doubt. Doubt becomes weakness. Inner doctrine tightens quietly. Teachings once symbolic harden into instruction. Leaders are elevated beyond ordinary rules, described as guides who see what others cannot. Loyalty is praised. Separation from critics is encouraged. Families outside the group are labeled distractions, even threats. Money follows belief. Members contribute assets, savings, properties. Financial entanglement deepens emotional dependence. Leaving would mean not only spiritual loss, but material ruin. Leaders frame this sacrifice as proof of commitment. The circle narrows. As months pass, the rhetoric shifts. Conversations turn toward endings. Not collapse, transition. Not death, departure. Members are told the world is entering a dangerous phase, and only those who follow precisely will move forward. Timelines are hinted at, never fully stated. Uncertainty keeps people compliant. Witnesses later describe rehearsals disguised as rituals. Instructions repeated until they feel inevitable. Dissent is managed privately. Those who hesitate are isolated, counseled, reminded of their vows. The group reinforces itself through shared language and shared fear. Geography becomes part of the control. Cells form across borders, Switzerland, Canada, and beyond. Communication is coordinated. Events are framed as synchronized acts of faith rather than isolated decisions. Leaders remain central, issuing guidance while maintaining plausible distance. Former members recall moments of quiet alarm, a detail that felt wrong, a directive that crossed an invisible line. But by then, leaving feels impossible. Identity, finances, relationships, and belief are bound together. The cost of refusal appears higher than the cost of obedience. As the countdown nears, preparation intensifies. Final instructions are described as necessary, compassionate, even loving. Members are told, this is not an end, but a crossing. That fear is natural, but doubt must be overcome for the good of all. The cliff edge appears not as panic, but as certainty. A belief system that once promised clarity now demands compliance with something irreversible. The leader's words carry weight, not because they shout, but because they have shaped every step leading here. The promise of transcendence tightens into a final command, and those inside are told this is the moment they have been preparing for all along. The aftermath does not arrive all at once. It unfolds across borders, calendars, and courtrooms. What first appears as isolated tragedies soon reveals a pattern investigators cannot ignore. Authorities in Switzerland and Canada begin comparing timelines. Locations that once seemed unrelated now align. Similar rituals, similar preparations, similar language found in letters and recorded messages. What was presented internally as spontaneous faith begins to look externally like coordination. Police raids expose carefully staged scenes. Documents describe ranks, coded terms, and financial flows. Bank records trace contributions moving upward toward leadership figures. Properties are registered in ways that obscure ownership. The structure, investigators conclude, was not accidental. Public shock follows. Media coverage spreads images of quiet towns suddenly linked to global headlines. Families of members speak cautiously, many still struggling to understand how belief turned fatal. Survivors describe pressure that built slowly, then all at once. They say refusal felt impossible without losing everything that defined them. Legal proceedings focus on responsibility rather than belief. Prosecutors avoid judging theology. Instead, they argue coercion, planning, and abuse of authority. The question is not what members believed, but how leaders used that belief to direct behavior. Emails, recordings, and witness testimony outline how instructions were framed as destiny rather than choice. Courts examine whether consent existed in any meaningful sense. Experts testify about psychological control, isolation, and dependency. Defense teams emphasize autonomy and faith. Prosecutors respond that autonomy collapses when leaders manage fear, finances, and identity at the same time. In some jurisdictions, criminal accountability proves difficult. Death removes key figures from trial. Evidence spans countries and years. Still, official findings describe orchestration, not coincidence. Reports conclude that leadership played an active role in shaping outcomes they claimed were spiritual inevitabilities. Public inquiries follow. Governments reassess how groups like this operate across borders with minimal oversight. Lawmakers debate how to intervene earlier without infringing on legitimate religious practice. The balance proves fragile. For families left behind, resolution is incomplete. Some members are remembered as victims. Others are viewed as participants. The distinction is painful and often contested. Memorials are quiet. Questions linger. The final reckoning is not only legal, but societal. How does devotion become leverage? When does guidance become command? And at what point does belief stop being a choice? The case leaves no clean ending, only an enduring unease that within a system built on trust and transcendence, the line between choosing and being pushed can disappear without warning. The house looks ordinary. Beige walls, neatly trimmed hedges. A quiet suburban street in San Diego County, where nothing appears out of place. Inside, however, sits one of the most unsettling scenes in modern American religious history. A silence so complete, it takes time to understand what it means. Marshal Applewhite did not present himself as a tyrant. He spoke softly, carefully. He framed his teachings not as domination, but as release. Followers were told they were not escaping the world out of fear, but graduating from it. The language was calm. The conclusions were absolute. Heaven's Gate preached purity through separation. Members were encouraged to detach from family, careers, even their own names. The outside world was described as corrupted, noisy, and spiritually dead. Inside the group, certainty replaced doubt. Rules were not enforced through shouting, but through shared belief that obedience meant clarity. Applewhite's authority grew through consistency. He repeated the same messages for years. Identity was restructured slowly. Haircuts matched, clothing matched, daily routines matched. Individuality dissolved into belonging. For members, this felt like peace, not loss. The rhetoric narrowed over time. Teachings about transformation became teachings about timing. The arrival of a comet was framed not as coincidence, but confirmation. Followers were told this was not an end, but a transition to a higher existence. Fear was reframed as attachment, hesitation as weakness. From the inside, former observers say, the world felt quieter the closer members moved toward this belief. News was filtered. Outside criticism was dismissed as ignorance. Applewhite positioned himself not as a god, but as a messenger, someone who understood what others could not. In the final days, preparations were methodical. There was no chaos reported, no outward struggle. The calm itself disturbed investigators later. Notes were left, videos recorded. The message was consistent. This was chosen. This was right. When authorities entered the house, the stillness was complete. 39 lives ended in the same place, under the same conviction. No signs of resistance. No attempt to flee. The image shocked the nation precisely because it did not look violent. It looked intentional. Public reaction was swift and horrified. Media replayed footage of Applewhite speaking directly to the camera, explaining the logic that led here. Psychologists analyzed how certainty can replace self-preservation. Religious scholars debated where belief ends and coercion begins. Families were left with questions that had no answers. How do you reach someone who believes leaving means spiritual death? How do you intervene when obedience feels like freedom? Heaven's Gate did not explode outward. It collapsed inward. A movement that promised escape from fear left behind an enduring one that control does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, patiently, until silence feels like salvation. It begins as treatment. Folding chairs in a circle, plain rooms, people arriving, broken, hopeful, ready to be told what to do next. Charles Manson presents Synanon as an answer for those failed by everything else. Addiction, aimlessness, regret. He promises structure where chaos once lived. The method is framed as honesty, confrontation as care. The core ritual, called the game, is introduced as therapy. Participants are encouraged to speak freely about one another. What starts as feedback sharpens into attack. Insults are justified as truth. Humiliation is reframed as progress. Over time, the boundary between help and control blurs. Man's authority grows as members internalize the rules. Questioning the system is labeled denial. Leaving is described as relapse. The group becomes both cure and judge. Isolation deepens. Members are urged to cut ties with family and outside influences. Children are raised communally. Relationships are monitored. Loyalty to Synanon replaces loyalty to self. Man's pronouncements harden into doctrine. His preferences become policy. Punishment escalates quietly. Shaving heads, forced labor, public shaming, all presented as necessary steps toward recovery. Those who comply are praised. Those who resist are singled out. Fear becomes a tool, softened by the language of care. As Synanon expands, so does its reach. Properties are acquired. Political connections are cultivated. Manson speaks less like a counselor and more like a leader convinced of his own inevitability. Critics are dismissed as enemies of healing. Then, the cracks widen. Reports surface of intimidation and violence. Former members describe coercion, not therapy. Investigators uncover patterns that no longer resemble rehabilitation. The most chilling moment arrives when a deadly warning is sent to a lawyer who challenges the group. A rattlesnake placed in a mailbox, meant as a message. Law enforcement steps in. Searches reveal weapons stockpiles. Financial records show misuse of funds. The image of benevolence collapses under scrutiny. Courts move not against belief, but against criminal conduct. The organization that claimed to save lives is now accused of endangering them. Synanon unravels under pressure. Properties are seized. Membership declines. Manson, once the center of everything, becomes isolated by the consequences of his own system. What was sold as recovery is legally defined as coercion. The aftermath leaves a complicated legacy. Some former members credit early sobriety. Others recount years of control and fear. The same practices that promised healing inflicted lasting harm. The case stands as a warning wrapped in good intentions. When recovery becomes obedience and help becomes leverage, damage can hide in plain sight. The language of care can become a leash, and by the time it tightens, many no longer recognize it as restraint. The lectures are refined. Soft lighting, calm voices, explaining destiny, harmony, and preparation. Doors close gently. From the outside, nothing appears extreme. From the inside, authority is already set. Joseph Di Mambro operates as the architect. Finances, documents, symbols, schedules. He manages the machinery that makes belief feel organized and inevitable. Luc Jouret is the messenger. Charismatic, articulate, persuasive. He travels, speaks, recruits. Together, they present certainty as compassion. Members are told they are chosen, not superior, but awakened. This status comes with responsibility. Silence is framed as loyalty. Questions are reframed as spiritual immaturity. Sacrifice becomes proof of advancement. What looks voluntary begins to narrow. The leadership structure is layered. Inner circles receive information others never see. Teachings change depending on rank. The highest level is described as burdensome knowledge, shared only with those deemed ready. This creates dependence. Those closest to the leaders feel special and trapped. Financial commitments deepen control. Contributions are encouraged, then expected. Assets are pooled. Records are complex. Leaving would mean losing not just belief, but stability. Leaders describe this loss as necessary purification. Fear is managed with reassurance. Investigations later note how instruction avoided direct language. Orders were framed as revelations. Timelines were suggested, not stated. Members were guided to conclusions presented as their own. This diffusion of responsibility becomes central to later debates. After the deaths, authorities across Europe and Canada compare findings. Documents, recordings, and witness accounts suggest coordination. Reports describe planning and preparation that contradicts claims of spontaneous spiritual choice. Leadership roles come into sharper focus. Legal conclusions remain careful. Courts and inquiries avoid judging theology. Instead, they examine behavior, control, coercion, abuse of authority. Investigators describe a system where consent was compromised by isolation, dependency, and manipulation. Supporters argue belief cannot be criminalized. Critics respond that leadership can be. The question becomes not why followers believed, but how belief was used. Emails and testimony indicate leaders knew outcomes were irreversible and proceeded anyway. Families speak of loved ones who changed slowly, then completely. Friends describe phone calls that sounded calm, resolved, final. Survivors recall pressure that felt gentle but relentless. No shouting, no chains, just certainty. The movement leaves no single villain and no clean ending. Di Mambro and Jouret are remembered not for spectacle, but for structure, for building a system where obedience felt like enlightenment. The enduring fear is subtle. Control does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as clarity, purpose, and peace, and by the time doubt returns, the doors are already sealed.